The Weight of Memory, a story by Carl Otto. Arthur Kessler's arthritic fingers fumbled with the latch on his pill organizer, the plastic case a stark reminder of his frailty. Sunlight filtered through dusty curtains, casting long shadows across the faded wallpaper of his modest apartment. Family photos lined the mantel, their smiling faces a sharp contrast to the emptiness that now filled his home. "Damn thing," Arthur muttered, his once commanding voice now thin and frail. The organizer finally opened with a soft click, spilling an array of colorful tablets onto the dining room table. He sighed, carefully sorting them into neat piles. As he reached for his glass of water, Arthur's gaze fell on a framed photo of a young woman, Suzanne, his granddaughter. The last time he'd seen her was 4 years ago, maybe 5. The memories blurred together, like watercolors left in the rain. "I'm sorry, mein Schatz," he whispered, his German accent, long suppressed, slipping through in moments of emotion. "I tried to make things right." Arthur pushed himself to his feet, joints creaking in protest. He shuffled towards the kitchen, leaning heavily on his cane. The tile floor felt cold and hard even beneath his padded slippered feet, each step a reminder of how far he'd fallen from the strong, vital man he once was. As he reached for the refrigerator door, a wave of dizziness washed over him. Arthur's vision swam, the kitchen tilting at impossible angles. He tried to steady himself, but his cane slipped on the smooth floor. Time seemed to slow as Arthur fell. He saw the edge of the kitchen counter rushing towards him, heard the clatter of his cane hitting the floor. Then pain exploded in his hip as he landed hard on the unforgiving tile. "Hilfe!" he cried out instinctively, then caught himself. "Help! Somebody, please!" But there was no one to hear, no one to come to his aid. Arthur lay there, breath coming in ragged gasps, the cold of the floor seeping into his bones. He tried to move, to pull himself towards the phone on the wall, but every motion sent shards of agony through his hip. As the initial shock faded, a deeper, more insidious fear began to creep in. How long would he lie here before someone found him? Days. The thought of dying alone, helpless on his kitchen floor, brought tears to Arthur's eyes. "I don't want to die," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Not like this. Not alone." A soft sound caught his attention, a whisper, so faint he might have imagined it. Arthur's eyes darted around the kitchen, searching for its source. There, in the corner by the pantry, he saw something, a shimmer in the air, like heat rising from summer pavement. But it was more than that. For just a moment, Arthur could have sworn he saw a face forming in the distortion. He blinked to clear his vision, and the shimmer was gone. But the feeling of being watched remained, prickling at the back of his neck. As Arthur lay there, helpless and afraid, his mind began to wander, drifting back to another time. Years earlier, Arthur adjusted his tie nervously as he approached the bustling backyard. Laughter and music drifted over the fence, a stark contrast to the knot of anxiety in his stomach. He clutched a small gift box wrapped in shimmering silver paper. "You shouldn't be here," a voice hissed. Arthur turned to see his daughter, Lisa, her face a mask of barely contained anger. "It's Suzanne's graduation," Arthur said softly. "I couldn't miss it." Lisa's eyes darted around, checking if anyone had noticed them. "I told you not to come. You're going to ruin everything." Before Arthur could respond, a delighted squeal cut through the tension. "Opa!" Suzanne, radiant in her blue graduation gown, rushed towards them. She threw her arms around Arthur, nearly knocking him off balance. "You came!" she exclaimed, her eyes shining with joy. Arthur's face lit up, years seeming to melt away from his weathered features. "Of course, mein Schatz. I wouldn't miss this for the world." Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing as Suzanne led Arthur into the party. Arthur smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He handed his granddaughter the small box. "A little something to celebrate your achievement." Suzanne unwrapped it eagerly, gasping as she revealed a delicate silver locket. "Oh, Opa, it's beautiful." "It belonged to your great-grandmother," Arthur explained, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been saving it for this day." As Suzanne hugged him again, Arthur caught sight of Lisa watching them, her expression unreadable. He remembered a time when she would have reacted the same way to his gifts. Before she knew. The afternoon wore on, and Arthur found himself seated at a table with some of Suzanne's friends. They were curious about him, asking about his accent and his life. For a while, he lost himself in telling sanitized stories of his youth, dating back to the 1950s. "Wow, Mr. Kessler," one of the boys said, "you've lived through so much history." Arthur's smile faltered for a moment. "Yes, perhaps too much." A commotion near the house drew their attention. Lisa was arguing with her husband, their voices carrying across the yard. "He can't stay, David. You know what he did." "It's Suzanne's day," David responded, trying to keep his voice down. "Can't we just—" "No," Lisa snapped. "I won't have him here, pretending everything's normal, not after what he did." Arthur's heart sank. He looked around the table, seeing confusion and curiosity on the young faces. Suzanne appeared at his side, her earlier joy replaced by concern. "Maybe I should go," Arthur said quietly, moving to stand. "No, please don't," Suzanne pleaded, placing a hand on his arm. She turned to the table. "I'm sorry, would you excuse us for a moment?" As they walked to a quieter corner of the yard, Arthur could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him. He'd tried so hard to be a good grandfather, to make amends in whatever way he could. But some sins, it seemed, were too great to be forgiven. "Opa," Suzanne said, her voice gentle, "I know Mom and Dad are upset, but I want you here. You've always been there for me." Arthur felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. "Oh, mein Schatz, you don't know how much that means to me, but perhaps it would be better if I left. I don't want to cause any more trouble." Suzanne's jaw set in a determined line, so reminiscent of Lisa at that age. "This is my graduation, and I want you here. They'll just have to deal with it." As she led him back to the party, Arthur felt a complex mix of emotions: love for his granddaughter, shame for his past, and a deep, aching sadness for all he had lost and could never regain. The rest of the party passed in a blur. Arthur sat quietly, watching Suzanne celebrate with her friends, treasuring what he feared might be his last moments with her. As the sun began to set, he made his way to the gate, unnoticed by most of the guests. Leaving so soon, Arthur turned to see Suzanne, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's late, mein Schatz, and I'm a tired old man," he said softly. Suzanne hugged him fiercely. "I love you, Opa, no matter what." As Arthur walked away, those words echoed in his mind. If she knew, he thought, what would she think of him? The memory faded, leaving Arthur alone with his thoughts. He blinked, disoriented, as the familiar surroundings of his small apartment came into focus. How long had he been lost in his memories? Minutes? Hours? Arthur's breath came in shallow gasps as he lay on the cold kitchen floor. The pain in his hip had dulled to a persistent throb, but a new, more insidious discomfort was creeping in. The chill of the tile seeping into his bones, the stiffness of lying immobile for too long. He blinked, trying to clear his vision. The kitchen seemed to waver, like a mirage in the desert. Was it the pain, or something else? Arthur squinted, his eyes straining in the dim light. There, by the pantry, a shadow, darker than the surrounding gloom. At first, Arthur thought it might be a trick of the light, a product of his fear-addled mind. But as he watched, the shadow seemed to solidify, taking on a vaguely human shape. Arthur called out, his voice cracking. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. It stood motionless, a silhouette against the faded wallpaper. Arthur's heart raced, pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. "Please," he whispered, "if someone's there, help me." The shadow remained still, but Arthur could have sworn he heard something. A soft sound, like a distant whisper. He strained his ears, trying to make out words. I can't hear you," Arthur said, his voice trembling. "Please, speak up." The whisper grew louder, but no clearer. It was as if multiple voices were speaking at once, overlapping and intertwining until they became an unintelligible murmur. A chill ran down Arthur's spine as a terrible thought occurred to him. He knew those voices. Somehow, impossibly, he knew them. "9," he breathed, shaking his head in denial. "You can't be here. You're not real." The shadow flickered, like a candle flame in a draught. For a moment, Arthur thought he saw features forming in the darkness. Hollow eyes, gaunt cheeks, mouths open in silent screams. The shadow paused, hovering at the edge of Arthur's vision. The whispers faded to a soft hum, like the buzzing of insects on a summer evening. For a moment, Arthur dared to hope that it might retreat. But the memories kept coming, as relentless as the tide. One memory in particular pushed its way to the forefront of his mind. A day that marked the beginning of the end of his carefully constructed new life. Arthur Kessler straightened his tie, taking a deep breath before entering the boardroom. At 55, he was no longer the young, ambitious man who had first joined Steinhardt and Associates 2 decades ago. The years had taken their toll, etching deep lines around his eyes and mouth, sprinkling silver through his once dark hair. "Kessler," Mr. Steinhardt nodded curtly as Arthur took his seat. "Let's hope your quarterly report is more impressive than last time." Arthur felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He'd been struggling to keep up with the younger, more aggressive brokers for years now. Every meeting felt like a battle. Every quarter, a war he was slowly losing. As he began his presentation, Arthur could feel the weight of scrutiny from his colleagues. Their eyes bored into him, judging every hesitation, every stumbled word. He pushed on, his accent thickening with stress as it always did. And as you can see from these projections, Arthur paused, noticing 2 younger associates whispering something about rumors they had heard about him. Then they noticed his gaze and fell silent, looking uncomfortable and a little intimidated. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm. Arthur loosened his collar, trying to focus on the figures before him, but the numbers swam on the page, replaced by other images: barbed wire fences, skeletal figures, piles of shoes. "Kessler," Mr. Steinhardt's sharp voice cut through the haze. "Are you quite all right?" Arthur blinked, realizing he'd stopped mid-sentence. "Yes, my apologies. As I was saying..." He stumbled through the rest of the presentation, acutely aware of the side-eyed glances and poorly concealed smirks. As the meeting adjourned, Arthur gathered his papers with trembling hands. "A moment, Kessler," Mr. Steinhardt called as the others filed out. Arthur's heart sank. He knew what was coming. "Arthur," Steinhardt began, his tone uncharacteristically gentle, "you've been with us a long time, but lately, well, your performance hasn't been up to our standards." "I understand, sir," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do better, I promise." Steinhardt sighed. "It's not just about the numbers, Arthur. There have been rumors, complaints from some of the younger staff about your past." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. "Sir, I don't want to know," Steinhardt cut him off. "What you did or didn't do before you came here. It's not my business, but it's affecting your work, and it's affecting morale." "Please," Arthur said, desperation creeping into his voice. "This job is all I have. I'll work harder. I'm sorry, Arthur," Steinhardt said, not unkindly, "but I think it's time for you to consider early retirement. For everyone's sake." As Arthur left the office, briefcase clutched to his chest like a shield, he felt the weight of 1,000 stares. In every face, he saw accusation. In every whisper, he heard condemnation. He had tried so hard to outrun his past, to build a new life, but no matter how far he ran, the shadows always caught up. Back in the present, Arthur gasped, the memory fading as quickly as it had come. The kitchen swam back into focus, with more shadowy figures lining up, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. The whispers had grown louder, a chorus of accusing voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "No," Arthur whimpered, squeezing his eyes shut. "Please, leave me alone." But when he opened his eyes, the figures were still there, and they were moving closer, their featureless faces somehow radiating an unmistakable aura of judgment and retribution. Arthur's breath came in ragged gasps as his dread grew, threatening to consume him entirely. The shadows seemed to pulse and shift, and suddenly Arthur felt himself being pulled into another memory, one from long ago. The dingy kitchen faded away, replaced by a small, shabby room in post-war Munich. Arthur found himself staring at his reflection in a grimy mirror. At 25, he should have been in the prime of his life. Instead, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his once proud posture was hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. It had been 3 years since the war ended. Arthur Kessler, a bland name, one with the ability to fade into the background. He touched the scar on his chin, a reminder of the accident that had conveniently altered his appearance just enough to avoid recognition. A knock at the door made him jump. "Herr Kessler, your rent is due." "Ja, Frau Miller. I'll have it tomorrow, I promise," Arthur called back, wincing at how easily the lie came to his lips. He'd lost another job last week, his third in as many months. It wasn't the work itself. Arthur had always been diligent, efficient, but the nightmares left him exhausted, prone to mistakes. And then there were the moments when a sound, a smell, would transport him back. Arthur shook his head, trying to dispel the memories. He had to focus on the present, on survival. Crossing the small room, he pulled a battered suitcase from under the bed. Inside, wrapped in a faded shirt, was a small bundle of cash, the last of his savings. As he counted out the rent money, a folded piece of paper fell to the floor. Arthur's heart raced as he recognized it, the letter from his mother sent just before everything changed. With trembling hands, he unfolded it, though he knew every word by heart. "My dearest Arthur," it began, "we are so proud of you, serving your country. But these rumors we hear, they cannot be true. But we know that you are a good son and a good man." Arthur crumpled the letter, a sob catching in his throat. He stood abruptly, needing to escape the suffocating confines of his room. Outside, the streets of Munich were busy with people rebuilding their lives, trying to forget the horrors of the past few years. Arthur envied them, their ability to move forward. As he walked, he found himself in a familiar part of town. Without conscious thought, his feet had carried him to a local Jewish temple, or what remained of it. The once grand building was now a burnt-out shell, a stark reminder of Kristallnacht and all that followed. Arthur stood before it, memories washing over him. He remembered standing in this very spot years ago, watching as the flames consumed the building. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words feeling woefully inadequate. "I'm so sorry." A hand on his shoulder made him flinch. Arthur turned to see an elderly man, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "It is a terrible thing, Ja," the man said, gesturing to the ruined synagogue. "So much lost." Arthur nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "But we must rebuild," the man continued, "not just buildings, but lives, hearts. It is the only way forward." As the man walked away, Arthur stood rooted to the spot, his words echoing in his mind. Rebuild. Could he rebuild himself? Could he ever atone for what he had done? Arthur stumbled back, his vision blurring with tears. He turned and ran, desperate to escape the ghosts of his past. But with every step, he knew the truth. There was no escaping what he had done. The guilt would follow him forever. The memory faded, dissolving like mist in the morning sun. But the weight of that guilt remained. Arthur found himself back in his kitchen, sprawled on the cold tile floor. The shadows that had been lurking at the edges of his vision now seemed to coalesce, taking on more distinct forms. "Please," Arthur whispered, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. I know that now. If I could take it all back." But the figures only drew closer, their silent judgment more damning than any words could ever be. Arthur felt the weight of his guilt pressing down on him, threatening to crush what was left of his spirit. As the spectral forms loomed over him, Arthur's mind was thrust back to the source of his deepest shame, a memory he had tried desperately to bury. A young and strong Arthur, in his crisp SS uniform, stood at attention, overseeing a work detail in the sweltering heat. His eyes swept across the ragged line of prisoners, their emaciated forms bent under the weight of their labor. Suddenly, he noticed an elderly man stumble and fall, his frail body crumpling to the dusty ground. It was clear the man lacked the strength to rise again. For a fleeting moment, Arthur's gaze locked with the fallen prisoners. Those watery eyes were filled with a potent mixture of fear, exhaustion, and a silent, desperate plea for mercy. "Get up, you lazy old fool. Please, I just need a moment." The old man's voice quivered and winced in pain as he held his hip. Casually, Arthur pulled out his Luger. He squared his shoulders, his voice cutting through the oppressive air. "If you can't work, you are worthless to me. Please, please, I can work." The man's voice filled with pain as he struggled to stand, but couldn't. "Please, just give me a moment." With almost a bored look on his face, Arthur leveled his pistol at the man. "Don't worry, you don't have to get up." The work details stopped their labor and began to look on in horror. The growing silence and dread sent an ache through everyone's bones. Then a shot rang out. The only sound that followed was leaves rustling in the wind. Then Keller's voice, a terrible harbinger of death. "Get back to work." As he strode away, boots crunching on the gravel, Arthur forced himself not to dwell on what would inevitably happen to those who couldn't keep up with the grueling pace. He had his duties, after all, and sentiment had no place in the machine of which he was now an integral part. The memory faded, leaving Arthur feeling hollow and cold. The years that followed seemed to blur together, a desperate attempt to outrun the horrors he had perpetrated. But no matter how far he ran, or how much time passed, the weight of his actions remained. Years later, Arthur Kessler sat alone in his modest living room, the weight of his past heavy on his shoulders. The man who had once wielded life and death with cold indifference now spent his days in quiet solitude, haunted by the ghosts of his actions. He had tried to build a new life, to find redemption in the love of his family, but the shadows of his past were never far behind. The doorbell rang, startling Arthur from his thoughts. He shuffled to the door, heart racing with both hope and dread. Lisa stood on the porch, Suzanne beside her. It was the first time they had visited in years. "Come in, please," Arthur said, his voice wavering. "I'm so glad you came." The living room was tense, with unspoken words. Lisa's eyes darted around, unable to settle on her father. Suzanne, now in her mid-20s, looked uncomfortable but determined. "I've been trying to reach out," Arthur began, "to explain, to apologize." "Apologize?" Lisa's voice was sharp. "Do you think that's enough? That you can just say sorry and erase what you did?" Arthur flinched at her words. "No, of course not. I know I can never truly atone, but I'm trying to do some good, to make up for it." Lisa stood abruptly. "You can't make up for genocide, Dad. You can't bring back the people you killed." Suzanne placed a hand on her mother's arm. "Mom, please." We agreed to hear him out. Arthur looked at his granddaughter, seeing a glimmer of the little girl who once adored him. "Suzanne, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm not that man anymore. I've changed." "Have you?" Lisa asked, her voice softer now, tinged with sadness. "Or have you just gotten better at hiding who you really are?" The question hung in the air, heavy with decades of pain and mistrust. Arthur opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no answer. Suzanne broke the silence. "Opa, I want to believe you've changed, but it's hard. What you did, it's unforgivable." "I know," Arthur whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "But I have to try. To be better, to do better. It's all I have left." As Lisa and Suzanne prepared to leave, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope. They had come, they had listened. It wasn't forgiveness, but perhaps it was a start. "We'll think about what you've said," Lisa said at the door, her voice carefully neutral. "But don't expect miracles, Dad. Some wounds never heal." As the door closed behind them, Arthur sank into his chair, a mixture of exhaustion and faint hope washing over him. He had faced his family, had taken the first tentative step towards reconciliation. It wasn't much, but it was something. He clung to that small spark of possibility, unaware that it would be the last time he'd ever see them. In the weeks and months that followed, Arthur waited anxiously for a call, a visit, any sign that the fragile bridge he'd tried to build would hold. But as time stretched on, that hope began to fade. Calls went unanswered, letters unopened. The silence grew deafening. Years passed, and Arthur's world gradually shrank. The promise of reconnection withered, leaving behind only the bitter taste of missed opportunities and unspoken words. His days blurred together in a haze of regret and loneliness. The memory of that final meeting, both a comfort and a torment. In the end, it hadn't been enough. The weight of his past had proven too heavy, the chasm too wide to cross. Arthur was left alone with his thoughts, his guilt, and the ghosts of what might have been. Now Arthur's breath came in shallow gasps as he lay on the cold kitchen floor. The chill of the tiles seemed to seep into his very bones, a physical manifestation of the cold loneliness that had become his life. As he struggled to move, to call for help, the shadows at the edges of his vision began to shift and deepen. Arthur's eyes widened in horror. The shadowy figures began to materialize, their forms initially vague and indistinct. Gradually, they took shape. Emaciated bodies, hollow eyes, faces etched with suffering. Men, women, children, all victims of the atrocities he had participated in decades ago. They stood in a silent circle around him, their eyes filled with an unspeakable sorrow and accusation. Arthur recognized some of them, faces that had haunted his nightmares for years. "I'm sorry," Arthur sobbed, his words seeming pathetically inadequate in the face of their silent judgment. "I've tried to change, to make amends. Please." But the figures remained unmoved, their silent presence more damning than any words could be. As Arthur lay there, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, the weight of his guilt threatened to crush him entirely. Suddenly, the lead figure, the man from the work detail, began to change. Its form shifted, growing taller, more imposing. With mounting dread, Arthur watched as it transformed into a shadowy version of himself. Young, strong, wearing the dreaded SS uniform. This specter of his past self stared down at him, eyes cold and unforgiving. "No," Arthur whimpered, tears streaming down his face. "Please, I'm not that man anymore. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But the figures remained silent, their accusing eyes never wavering. The shadowy SS version of Arthur loomed over him, its cold, merciless eyes reflecting all the cruelty and indifference he had once embodied. With deliberate slowness, the spectre reached into its holster and withdrew a Luger pistol. Arthur's eyes widened in recognition. It was the same weapon he had carried all those years ago. "I'm ready," Arthur whispered, closing his eyes. "Do what you must." The last thing Arthur heard was the ominous click of the Luger's hammer being cocked. Then, everything went black. Arthur Kessler's lifeless body lay on the cold kitchen floor, his unseeing eyes fixed on the ceiling. The shadows that had haunted him in his final moments had dissipated, leaving behind only the stark reality of his lonely death. As we observe this scene, we are left to ponder the complexities of human nature and the weight of our actions. Arthur Kessler, once an SS officer, spent decades grappling with the atrocities he committed. He sought redemption, tried to change, and longed for forgiveness. But was it enough? Can a lifetime of regret and attempts at atonement balance the scales against unspeakable crimes? Are their sins so grievous that they remain beyond the reach of forgiveness, no matter how sincere the remorse? What is the nature of true repentance? Is it found in the words we speak, the actions we take, or the changes we make within ourselves? And who has the right to grant absolution for crimes against humanity? Perhaps the most difficult question of all is this: in a world scarred by hatred and violence, how do we break the cycle? Can we learn from the darkest chapters of history, or are we doomed to repeat them? As Arthur Kessler's story comes to its lonely end, we are left to wrestle with these questions. His life and death serve as a stark reminder of the long shadow cast by our choices and the enduring power of our past actions. In the end, is forgiveness a gift we grant to others, or a grace we hope to receive ourselves? And in the face of unforgivable acts, can we find a way to move forward without forgetting, to heal without absolving?